1842, Georgia. The Harper plantation stretched across red earth and pine-shadowed fields, a kingdom built on backs bent and hands bleeding. In its center stood the big house, white pillars gleaming like bone in the sun, while around it the quarters sagged in mud and smoke. On this land lived a man the Harpers did not call by name. They called him Rag. His true name was Eli, but names were fragile things on a plantation. They could be traded, mocked, erased. And Eli's had been buried the day the masters decided he was no longer a man, but a joke. It happened after he raised his arm against William Harper, not to strike him, but to shield a child. She was 12 years old, thin as a stalk, and William's hand had closed on her wrist, tugging her toward the shadows of the barn. Eli had stepped forward without thought, his voice low, his chest wide enough to block the way. That moment, brief as the flicker of a match, was enough. Enough to condemn him. For his defiance, the overseers dragged him into the yard. They stripped him to the waist, lashed him until his back gleamed red with sweat and blood, and then, worst of all, they covered his head with a burlap sack. They cut 2 ragged holes for his eyes, tied the knot tight around his neck, and laughed. "This here's the new face of Rag," William declared, holding him up for the guests gathered on the veranda. "See how he looks. Ain't he fine for show?" From that day forward, Eli was forced to wear the sack always. Sunrise to sundown, through storms, through fever, through labor in the rows. The sack stank of mildew and blood, but it became his skin. His punishment was not just pain, it was spectacle. Children of the Harpers threw stones at him for sport. White boys from town, brought to see the fields, tested their aim by striking the holes in the sack. When they hit, they cheered. When Eli stumbled, they laughed. The women, mistresses and daughters of neighbors, turned their faces away when he passed, pretending to be scandalized, though their mouths curled with amusement. "The faceless man," they whispered, as though the sight of him were a parlor trick, not a life condemned. Overseers found new ways to use him. Sometimes they called him into the yard when visitors came from neighboring estates. They would set him on his knees, lash him once or twice, and say, "See, the sack man don't scream." Then they would drink and slap their thighs, as though cruelty were a form of entertainment. Eli learned silence. Each lash, each jeer, each clod of dirt thrown into the rough fabric pressed itself into his memory. He carried them like splinters beneath the skin, too deep to pull free. But silence was not surrender. Beneath the mask, he kept his eyes open. He learned to watch. He saw which overseer drank too much, which master's hand shook when he signed ledgers, which key turned which door. He memorized the rhythm of the guard dog's barks, the creak of every stair, the weakness in the hinges of the barn. To the world, he was Rag, the faceless fool, the beaten man, the mute spectacle. But inside, Eli was shaping himself into something else, something that waited. At night in the quarters, he sat apart from the others. The sack never came off. Children whispered that if they looked into the holes, they would see no eyes, only darkness. Some of the elders pitied him, offering scraps of meat or whispered prayers. Others avoided him altogether, fearing his curse. But Eli did not crave pity. He did not need comfort. What he carried was heavier, older, sharper than sorrow. He carried the oath he had made to himself that first night, when his back burned and the sack clung to his skin with blood. One day, the laughter will stop. He remembered the girl he had tried to protect. They had sold her south the week after. He never saw her again, but her silence, her wide, terrified eyes beneath the master's grip, stayed with him beneath the sack. She was the beginning of his vow. The seasons passed, and Eli's body bore their marks. His shoulders thickened from the rows, his hands calloused like iron, but the sack with its eye holes remained. In summer, sweat soaked it until it stank. In winter, frost stiffened its fibers until it scratched his skin raw. It became his second face, his prison, and his shield. The Harpers grew accustomed to the sight. They spoke of him casually, like one might mention a piece of furniture. Send Rag to fetch the wood. Have Rag stand in the yard for the guests. They no longer even remembered the name Eli. But Eli remembered. He whispered it to himself at night, low and fierce, so the sack would not swallow it whole. The children of the quarters sometimes crept close, curious. One boy dared ask him, "Mr. Rag, do you got a face under there?" Eli turned slowly, his eyes burning through the holes, and the boy fled. Word spread among the children. He ain't got no face no more. And in a way it was true. The Harpers had stolen his, and in its place they had given him legend. Yet legends can turn. What the masters thought was mockery became mask. What they thought was humiliation became concealment. Beneath the burlap, Eli's eyes never stopped watching. His silence grew heavy as stone. And inside him, a storm gathered, patient, waiting for its night. 1842 to 1843, Georgia. The Harper name fattened itself on other people's breath, and the land learned to keep quiet or be broken. They were 7, the masters: William, Henry James, Robert, Thomas, Edwin, and the youngest, Charles, who smiled like a blade kept clean. Each kept his own manner of cruelty, as a gentleman keeps a favorite dog. They wore cotton like crowns, and made commandments out of whims. The county courted them. The church blessed them. The newspapers called them enterprising men. But in the quarters they were storms with human faces. William, the eldest, loved order shaped by fear. He corrected men beneath the live oaks, because the branches made a cathedral of punishment, and the birds flew away at the first cry. He called it instruction. He hung a man once not to ll him, but to make him dangle and watch sunrise without breath, until he begged to be small. When the man lived, William praised Providence, and had him whipped for ingratitude. Henry had dogs trained to the scent of a runaway sweat. He liked a chase more than a capture. He would wait until dusk, drink from a silver flask, loose the hounds, and ride behind them humming a hymn while flesh met teeth beyond the cane. He told guests the sport cured his melancholy. When they laughed, he felt adored. James, the scholar, wore spectacles and studied bodies like ledgers. He measured rations by the handful and watered barrels, with wrought to see how long a man survived on economy. He wrote notes in a neat hand about swelling, about silence, about at which hour a person's eyes stopped pleading. He called it inquiry, improvement, stewardship. Robert managed the books and the sales. He sold daughters to pay for a billiard table. He sold sons to buy new lamps for the parlor. He never raised his voice or his hand, only his pen. His cruelty had no sound. It was a door closing softly and never opening again. Thomas had a temper like summer lightning. He could not endure a song sung off beat. He broke fingers to teach rhythm. He claimed he hated mess, yet he made it wherever he walked and let others scrub it away. The only prayer he ever learned was now. Edwin believed himself merciful because he smiled while he hurt you. He told stories while he punished, to make the time pass, and afterward he might press a coin into a bleeding palm for your trouble. He wanted to be loved, and when he was not, he punished the lack of love. Charles, young and polished, did little himself. He watched. He did not stare at wounds. He studied the faces of those who watched wounds being made. He hoarded secrets in his quiet. People mistook him for gentle. He simply preferred his hands clean. Eli measured them all from behind the sack. The burlap scratched like a whisper that never ended, but it gave him darkness in which to study daylight. He learned the weight of keys on each man's belt by sound. William's heavy ring, Robert's clink like coin, Henry's small iron bite. He learned steps by footfall, Thomas quick, James counting, Charles a careful shadow. He mapped their habits the way others map rivers, by the places the ground erodes. The big house kept time with them. The staircase sighed under William's stride at the 10th riser. The west veranda cracked in winter when Edwin crossed it humming. The pantry door, when opened for Robert's midnight bookkeeping, made a small mouse noise that no one heard but Eli. The parlor chandelier chimed when Henry laughed before a hunt. All these sounds went into Eli's ledger where no eye could spy it. His mind, sharp as a hook filed on stone. The quarters watched him and saw only loss. Children called him Ghost. Women crossed themselves without crossing themselves, a gesture done in breath. Men nodded, grief-shaped, and looked away. They thought the sack had swallowed him whole. It had, but what it swallowed fermented. He gathered pieces as if repairing a broken him. Scraps of chain from the wheelwright's pile, short, rust-bitten lengths cool to the touch even in heat. A broken iron hoop from a sugar barrel, which he stole with a stumble and a cough, then hid beneath the ash pit, worrying it against stone at night until its edge remembered how to bite. Nails flattened into tongues. A strap from an old mule's tack that he braided with his own hair into a silent knot. A glass shard nested in cloth. He made a pocket inside the pocket of his ragged trousers, with thread begged from a kind hand in the sewing room. He kept everything near the bone. Eli also gathered moments. William's weakness for spectacle. He must have witnesses, or the cruelty felt incomplete. Henry's thirst, which put more flask than aim into late-night hands. James's curiosity, which could be led down a hallway if one left an oddity in its path. A cup of water with a sprig of mint. A doorway propped just so. Robert's predictable Sabbath hour. Thomas's need to be first through any door. Edwin's breath that caught on stairs if he climbed too fast. Charles's habit of pausing at mirrors, straightening a tie. A curl, a conscience. Under the sack, Eli rehearsed. He practiced breath that did not tremble, footsteps that did not sing. He learned to lift the kitchen latch with a twist that sang only to him. He lifted lids to learn the weight of brass. He replaced them without a whisper. He carried wood, pails, shame, each with equal steadiness, because steadiness is a blade no one respects until it opens them. He watched who slept where and who set pistols near a bed. He learned the hour when fireflies stitched the yard and watchers' eyelids drooped. He learned which door jambs had been repainted to hide an old stain and which stains would not be covered by paint or time. He learned how laughter travels through walls and what it hides. He learned that mockery becomes carelessness when the mouth grows used to victory's taste. In the fields, he moved like weather. He did the work. He bent and rose, but without hurry, without lag. Overseers found little to strike except his back, and they often preferred faces. With Eli, they settled for spectacle, and so they saved him for evenings, for guests. In this way, they kept him alive for what he was becoming. Sometimes at night the old ones hummed songs from far before Georgia, in rhythms that bent around pain like reeds around a rock. The sack muffled sound. Still he heard. The music did not heal him. It hardened him into the shape of what he must do. Mercy in their mouths made iron in his. One rain-silvered afternoon, James had a notion to test how little water a man could live on. He ordered rations cut and a barrel seasoned with something that spoiled more than taste. For 3 days the quarters moved through a dizziness that made edges crueler. Eli limited his own sips, not from obedience but from memory. He wanted to remember how the mouth becomes desert, how the heart knocks at the ribs when the well is a rumor. He kept that sensation like a tool wrapped in cloth for later use. The knowledge of thirst, his and theirs. On the road by the cotton gin stood a ruined wagon with a wheel rim half buried. Eli worked it loose with a stick and his silence. In the dusk he pressed it against the rough of the ash pit stone and began to draw it back and forth, until the metal sang quiet. A hoop became a crescent. A crescent became a blade that wanted a name. He did not give it one. He only fed it patience. The 7 names arranged themselves inside him like candles in a dark chapel. William, Henry, James, Robert, Thomas, Edwin, Charles. He spoke them without sound while the rain tapped the roof, and the sack breathed damp against his cheeks. He did not picture their deaths. He pictured their surprise, their faces finding that the world had another face beneath the sack, and that face would not turn away. Once Charles caught him in a mirror, Eli carrying wood past a gilt frame. Their reflections met. Charles flinched, then smiled because he had been seen flinching, and he hated that. "Careful there, Rag," he said lightly. "Don't scuff the parquet." Eli tilted the bundle, so his tread fell softer. He did not break stride. He put that flinch in his pocket beside the hoop. Plantation days drew themselves thin toward winter. The air learned to bite. The Harpers made plans for a feast to secure favors, to polish their name on the tongues of men who mattered to such things. Turkeys fattened. Wine traveled. Music was promised. The big house was cleaned until it shone with a kind of lie. They ordered more firewood. They ordered laughter. The sack man listened. He knew where the extra candles were kept and how quickly they guttered in a draft. He knew which window latch stuck in the dining room and where the floor dipped by the head of the table. He knew that guests dull their ears with drink and sharpen their tongues with cruelty. He knew the space between a toast and a swallow, between a threat and a hand raised, between a chair scraped back and a voice that fails. He did not ask the Lord to see him. He did not ask memory to forgive him. He asked the blade to keep its edge and his breath to keep its count. Then he folded himself into the work as if it were any other day, because the last day before a storm often looks like weather that will hold. 7 names, 7 debts, 7 doors that would soon open into a different house than the one they believed they owned. And in the middle of every room, though they did not know it, stood a man they had tried to make faceless, quiet, steady, collecting darkness the way some men collect favors. Eli felt the storm rise inside him without thunder. No omen split the sky. Only small sounds. A key's soft kiss in the pantry lock. The hush of the hoop against stone. The secret in Charles's flinch. The sigh of the 10th riser. The chime of glass when Henry laughed. All of it gathering. All of it ready. They thought they had made him into a joke. They had made him into judgment. The Harper plantation glowed with preparations. A feast was coming. The kind meant to remind neighbors of the family's power. Wagons creaked in with barrels of rum, turkeys fattened, candles stacked like bones. Music would fill the big house. Silver would shine. But in the shadows of the yard, the sack man sharpened silence into steel. Eli had measured time by humiliation, and now it had ripened into judgment. His blade was nothing more than a broken hoop of iron, rubbed thin against stone until it remembered its teeth. He carried scraps of chain twisted into a garrote, nails filed flat into tongues that could pierce. Hidden under ash, under rags, under the mask they thought had erased him. He was faceless to them still, but facelessness was his disguise, and tonight it was his crown. The evening began with laughter. Lanterns burned high, spilling gold across the columns of the big house. Neighbors arrived in carriages that rattled over the gravel drive. Men in broadcloth coats, women in satin gowns. Voices echoed with arrogance, ringing through the winter air. The Harper brothers greeted them with open hands and closed hearts. 7 men, 7 tyrants, each with wine already wetting their lips. Inside, the long dining table blazed with food, hams glazed in molasses, oysters shucked raw, wild turkey steaming with herbs. Slaves bent and bowed, serving plates they would never taste. Eli moved among them, still wearing the sack, still bent as though obedience had drained his bones. To every guest he looked broken. To the other slaves he looked resigned. But under the sack his eyes were wide, steady, measuring distance, counting steps. The brothers roared with pleasure at his sight. "Bring us the ragman," William called, slapping the table until glasses trembled. "What's a Harper feast without our scarecrow?" Henry raised his flask, dogs barking outside at the scent of meat. James adjusted his spectacles, noting how the sack still clung tight around Eli's skull. Edwin laughed, promising entertainment after supper. Perhaps the sack man should dance, stumble for amusement. Robert murmured agreement, without lifting his eyes from the wine ledger he kept even at the feast. Thomas cursed at a servant for spilling a drop. Charles, youngest and coldest, only watched, eyes gleaming, lips curled. Eli said nothing. He set the last plate. His hands moved steady, iron hidden under rags, silence sharper than speech. The meal began. Forks struck china, knives sliced meat. The room swelled with laughter, a tide of arrogance crashing against the walls. But beneath the noise, Eli felt the storm gather. His oath pounded in his chest. 7 names, 7 debts. When the moment came, it came without ceremony. William was first. He rose for a toast, raising his glass to the rafters. His words froze mid-sentence as Eli stepped forward. The sack still covered his face, but in his hand the hoop of iron gleamed. One strike. Quick, clean. The eldest Harper fell back against the table, wine spilling like blood across the cloth. For a heartbeat the room gasped. Then Henry lunged, roaring for pistols. But Eli was faster, the chain flashing in his hands. Dogs barked outside, chained and useless. Henry's flask clattered as the garrote cut his cry short. His body twitched, toppled into the candles, setting wax to spill. James stumbled back, Scholar's eyes wide with terror. He muttered of order, of reason, fumbling for an explanation even as Eli's blade tore across his fine waistcoat. His notes, his ledgers, his cruel experiments ended in silence on the floorboards. Robert rose, spectacles falling, trying to slip away into the shadows. Numbers had always been his refuge, the quiet cruelty of the pen. But the sack man followed. The blade found him too, and the ink of his account book mixed with blood, smearing the record of lives he had sold. Thomas rushed forward, fury in his veins, fists ready. He was wild, a storm with no thought but rage. He swung, he cursed, he kicked. Eli took the blows without sound, then drove iron through his chest with the force of years chained down. The young master fell, still cursing even as his voice failed him. Edwin begged as he stumbled back, smiling through tears, promising mercy he had never given. Eli's silence answered. The blade cut off his laughter, and Charles, the watcher, the one who had smiled at cruelty but never dirted his own hands, was last. He tried to speak, but words caught in his throat. Eli lowered the blade. For one long breath, sack against his skin, he let Charles see the faceless mask he had made of him. Then the blade fell, and Charles joined his brothers on the ground. The hall was chaos. Wine spilled, food scattered, chairs overturned. The smell of iron mixed with roasted meat, with smoke, with candle wax. Slaves gathered at the doorways, eyes wide, some in terror, some in awe. Children clung to their mothers. The overseer lay dead at his post, caught before he could raise his whip. Eli stood among the bodies. The sack still covered his head, but his shoulders were tall now, his breath steady. Slowly, with hands that had hidden too long, he pulled the sack from his face. The fabric fell, stained and frayed, to the bloodied floor. His face was not broken. It was weathered, scarred, marked by years of lash and labor, but it was his. The slaves in the doorway stared, as though seeing a ghost return to flesh. He lifted his gaze to them. There was no smile, no triumph, only resolve, sharp as the blade still dripping in his hand. "Remember," he said, his first word in years. By dawn, they captured him. The county swelled with whispers. The madman in the sack, the faceless slave, the Harper butcher. The trial was quick, the verdict certain. He was sentenced to die before winter's end. Newspapers called it savagery, madness, the work of a devil. But in the quarters, in the shadows of every field and fire, his name was carried soft and fierce. Eli, the man mocked, masked, erased, who had risen faceless and left his mark on 7 masters. The sack was hidden away, kept as relic. Children whispered of it at night. Mothers told his name like a warning, like a prayer. Eli of Georgia had become more than a man. He had become the shape of judgment itself, a storm that had once been silence. 1843 to 1844, Georgia. Dawn rose thin over the Harper place, and the county woke to a house that had forgotten how to speak. Chairs lay turned on their backs like stunned animals. Wine stained the rugs. The chandelier held its breath. By noon, riders came, sheriff, judge, men with paper hats of authority, and the word traveled quicker than horses. The sack man did it. They chained Eli in the yard where he had been displayed for sport. Children who once threw clods at him hid now behind their mothers' skirts. An overseer from a neighboring place spat near his feet, then remembered the 7 names, and looked away. They covered his head, not with the burlap he knew, but with a gray hood that smelled of mold and pride. Newspapers arrived before the coroner. Madman in the sack slaughter 7. They wrote about savagery. They did not write about a child pulled toward a barn, or water turned sour, or fingers broken for rhythm. They wrote about the loss of pillars. No one wrote about the pillars' shadows. The trial was a sermon to the mirror. The judge criticized the manner, not the years that made the manner necessary. The ladies in the gallery dabbed their eyes as if grief were perfume. A lawyer said Eli had no motive. The room nodded. For rooms like that are trained not to see motive when it looks like a man in chains. When asked for a plea, Eli lifted his head. The burlap was gone, but the memory of it held like a second skull. He said nothing. Silence stood for him the way it had stood with him. Witnesses spoke. One swore he had seen the Sack man practicing murder in the shape of carrying wood. Another swore he heard him laugh, though no one had ever heard him laugh. The slaves from the quarters were brought, eyes pressed to the floor. A woman with gray in her hair said only, "He kept the work." The court took that to mean obedience. It meant something else. The verdict came tied with a bow, guilty, and quickly. The sentence, hanging before the courthouse on market day. So understanding would be public. Understanding, here, meant a lesson for anyone who mistook breath for ownership. They offered him a preacher. Eli looked at the man's soft hands and shook his head once. They offered him whiskey. He asked for water. They offered him the sack, as if it were his true face, as if the county deserved that last cruelty. He refused. If the world wanted a face at the end, it would have to take the one they had tried to erase. The morning chosen for the hanging was bright and deceitful. Orange peels littered the square. Chickens shook dust from their wings. Men practiced outrage aloud. Boys climbed wheels to see better. A girl in a blue bonnet stared at the rope like it was a question grown from the sky. They brought him out, wrists bound, ankles hobbled. He walked without hurry, the way a field walks across seasons. The sheriff recited the words that make K***ling lawful. The judge corrected a date. Someone in the crowd shouted monster. Eli's eyes found the fig tree beyond the stocks, and for a heartbeat the world arranged itself into his ledger one final time. Wind from the east, the creak at the 10th riser, the chime of glass when Henry laughed, now gone. "Any last words?" the sheriff asked, voice careful, as if words could undo rope. Eli looked over the faces, the buyers, the gawkers, the ones who had cheered when he stumbled under the sack. He searched past them, to the cluster from the quarters. A child he did not know clutched her mother's hem. The mother did not blink. "Remember," he said, the same word he had given in the hall, small and absolute. Then he stepped where they told him to step. They dropped the board. The rope answered. The county exhaled, some in relief, some in hunger. A hat fell. A horse stamped. After, they cut him down with a care reserved for furniture. They wrote justice concluded and went home to supper. But the story did not stay in the square. The sack, someone had hidden it. No one would say who. Some nights, a shape the size of a folded shirt passed from hand to hand in the quarters, then disappeared under a pallet. Mothers did not let children touch it, but they let them look, because looking is a kind of oath. Songs shifted. Work chants altered a beat at the 10th line, a secret nod to a step that had always sighed. Men setting traps on the riverbank began to say 7 names like beads. William, Henry James, Robert, Thomas, Edwin Charles. Not loudly, not even fully, just enough to keep the air honest. In the kitchens of other houses, servants set knives with the edge facing in, a quiet sign among themselves that a blade need not shout to be true. In the big house, the new owners painted the dining room a lighter color. They replaced the rugs, changed the chandelier, hired a pianist to teach the silence new manners. Still, the floor dipped where the head chair had stood, and sometimes a candle guttered when no door was open. Visitors blamed drafts. The servants did not. Years turned. Children who had watched from behind skirts became women with lines like roots at the corners of their eyes, and they told the story their way. Lean, bone-sharp, without ornament. The newspapers browned and crumbled, the ledgers mildewed. The judge's name slid off a stone in the churchyard. But the word remember kept its edge. Farther off, in fields that did not know the Harper name, men began to say to one another, when nights were long and overseers careless, the sack is not a mask, it is a warning that humiliation is a fuse, that silence can count and wait, that a face, once stolen, returns like weather. Eli was not a saint. He was not a myth. He was a man whose patience outlived his shame. They tried to bury him under paperwork and rope. The ground returned him as a lesson. On some winter evenings, when frost climbs the fences and the dogs refuse to sing, the air over the old yard changes weight. A breeze moves that is not wind. In that hush, if you listen hard enough to the boards, you can almost hear a careful foot on the 10th riser and the soft chime of glass that will never laugh again. Then only the word he left, remember,